When I was researching Heart of Darkness, I kept running into the same uncomfortable realization. Joseph Conrad didn't invent his darkness out of thin air. He borrowed it. Not just from the Congo, not just from colonial brutality, but from specific men, specific expeditions, specific acts that were so disturbing they barely survived in the historical record at all. One story, in particular, kept resurfacing. A story whispered through footnotes, letters, and testimony, never fully denied, never fully resolved. It revolves around a single question. A question so grotesque that even asking it feels wrong. Did the grandson of the founder of Jameson Irish Whiskey pay to have a young girl killed and eaten simply so he could watch? Not as punishment, not as warfare, but out of curiosity. Many people believe the answer is yes. Others argue it's an exaggeration, a lie, or a convenient accusation leveled at a dead man who could no longer defend himself. After examining the evidence, the testimonies, and the man's own words, I believe the answer is yes. Probably. But to understand why this question exists at all and why it refuses to disappear, we need to step back into one of the most catastrophic expeditions of the 19th century. An expedition so disastrous that it effectively ended an era of private European exploration in Africa. An expedition remembered not for its supposed mission of rescue, but for what happened when authority collapsed, morality evaporated, and men were left without consequence. This is the story of the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition. And this is the controversy history now remembers as the Jameson Cannibal Affair. To understand how a question like this could even exist, we have to understand where it took place and what kind of world produced it. By the late 19th century, Europe was in the middle of a territorial frenzy. Africa had become a map to be carved, renamed, and exploited, often under the language of humanitarianism. European powers claimed they were bringing order, technology, and civilization. In reality, they were extracting rubber, ivory, and labor by force. Nowhere was this contradiction more extreme than in the region that would become the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In 1885, King Leopold II of Belgium did something unprecedented. Instead of turning the Congo into a colony governed by the Belgian state, he purchased it as his personal property, naming it the Congo Free State. That distinction mattered. It meant there were no meaningful legal limits, no parliamentary oversight, no ethical restrictions beyond whatever Leopold himself chose to impose, which was effectively none. Under the banner of humanitarian reform, the Congo became one of the most violent extraction zones on Earth. Forced labor, mutilation, starvation, and mass death were not side effects, they were systems. And within this environment, a particular kind of expedition flourished. Private expeditions. Instead of sending national armies into the interior, European governments increasingly relied on privately funded explorers. These men raised their own money, recruited their own forces, and planned their own routes, all while operating under loose governmental approval. They were celebrities of their time. Men who went where maps ended. Men who returned with stories the public could barely imagine. And among the most famous of them was Henry Morton Stanley. By the time this story begins, Stanley was already a legend, a man associated with discovery, endurance, and triumph. When a crisis emerged deep in Central Africa, he was the obvious choice to lead a rescue mission no nation wanted to handle directly. That mission would be called the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition. On paper, it was humanitarian. In reality, it was political, financial, and deeply compromised from the start. And once it entered the Congo Free State, it entered a place where morality was optional, authority was unchecked, and human life was negotiable. The kind of place where unimaginable things could happen and not immediately be seen as unforgivable. To understand why this expedition unraveled the way it did, we need to understand how these missions actually worked, and who was trusted to control them. Private expeditions in the 19th century existed in a gray zone. They were not official military campaigns, but they were often supplied, armed, and politically supported by European governments. The explorers running them were given extraordinary autonomy. They decided the route. They chose the personnel. They enforced discipline. And in the field, there was no meaningful oversight. Henry Morton Stanley thrived in that system. By the time he was selected to lead the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition, Stanley had already made his name navigating the Congo River and crossing vast sections of Central Africa. He was celebrated as resilient, decisive, and relentless, exactly the kind of man European audiences believed could survive anywhere. But Stanley was not operating independently. At the time, he was under the personal employ of King Leopold II. That relationship shaped everything about the expedition. On a map, the fastest and safest way to reach Equatoria, where Emin Pasha was trapped, would have been from the east, through territories already controlled or influenced by European powers. Instead, Stanley was instructed to take the expedition west through the Congo Free State, Leopold's Congo. This decision added months of travel, dramatically increased risk, and forced the expedition through regions already devastated by forced labor, slaving networks, and violence. But it also allowed Leopold's interests to benefit from the movement of men and goods through his private territory. This was not a purely humanitarian mission. The expedition carried weapons, including the first Maxim machine gun ever brought to Africa. It transported massive quantities of ivory, and it relied on existing trade networks that were deeply entangled with slavery. From the very beginning, the mission was compromised. Stanley assembled a force of roughly 700 men, European officers, Sudanese soldiers, porters, couriers, and hired locals. The structure was rigidly hierarchical, and authority flowed downward with little restraint. Before departure, Stanley gave a speech emphasizing restraint. He claimed their purpose was not conquest, not destruction, but rescue. That claim would not survive contact with reality. Because once the expedition entered the interior, communication collapsed, supplies failed to arrive as planned, and Stanley made a decision that would ultimately destroy the mission from within. He divided the expedition into two separate columns. A forward column, which he personally led deeper into the continent, and a rear column, tasked with maintaining supplies and waiting for reinforcements. What happened to the forward column was brutal. What happened to the rear column was catastrophic. And it is within that collapse, isolated, desperate, and unchecked, that the Jameson Cannibal Affair would emerge. Among the men selected for the expedition was someone who, on paper, did not belong in a story like this. James Jameson. He was the grandson of John Jameson, the founder of Jameson Irish Whiskey, one of the most successful and recognizable liquor brands in the world. Jameson grew up surrounded by wealth, stability, and opportunity. But unlike many heirs of powerful families, he did not pursue the family business. Instead, he pursued nature. By the time he joined the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition, Jameson had already traveled extensively. He had explored North America, crossed parts of Africa, and built a reputation as a naturalist. Several bird species were named after him. His work was respected in scientific circles. He was not a reckless adventurer looking for glory. He was not a soldier, and he was not known for cruelty. If anything, Jameson represented refinement, education, curiosity, and the Victorian belief that careful observation could bring understanding to the world. That is what makes his presence in this story so unsettling. Because Jameson did not enter the expedition as a subordinate laborer or an anonymous officer, he entered it as a man of means, influence, and choice. He volunteered, he paid his own way, he was there because he wanted to be. And when Stanley divided the expedition into two columns, Jameson was assigned to the rear column. This was not the position of honor. The forward column carried momentum, attention, and the illusion of progress. The rear column existed to wait, to manage supplies, and to endure uncertainty without recognition. It was placed under the command of Edmund Barthelot, a former British Army officer whose temperament would soon prove disastrous. Jameson would remain behind with Barthelot and hundreds of men, cut off from Stanley, dependent on unreliable trade networks, and surrounded by a region already destabilized by slaving operations and colonial violence. This is where the narrative shifts. Up to this point, Jameson's life reads like a respectable Victorian resume: wealth, travel, science, accomplishment. But respectability only matters where there are boundaries, and the rear column had none. What followed would not be shaped by reputation or intention, but by isolation, desperation, and the gradual erosion of moral restraint. And it is in that erosion, not in sudden madness, that the most disturbing chapter of this expedition began to take form. The rear column was never meant to be heroic. Its purpose was logistical: to wait, to hold supplies, and to establish a steady flow of food and ammunition to Stanley's forward force. It required patience, discipline, and restraint. It got none of those things. Almost immediately after the expedition entered the Congo, the rear column began to fail. Communication lines collapsed. Promised boats were not ready. Supplies did not arrive. Much of the expedition's survival plan depended on a man named Tipu Tip, a powerful trader whose network stretched across Central Africa. On paper, he was a logistical asset. In reality, he was one of the most prolific slave traders in the region. His presence poisoned everything. Local communities refused to trade with the expedition once they learned Tipu Tip was involved. Villages that might have exchanged food for goods shut their doors entirely. Fear traveled faster than supplies. When Tipu Tip realized he could not establish the supply line he had promised, largely because he demanded ammunition that Stanley had already taken with him, he simply left. And with him went the last illusion of structure. The rear column was stranded. Weeks passed. Then months. Food ran low. Disease spread. Men deserted when they could. Those who remained grew increasingly desperate. Under Edmund Barthelot's command, discipline did not stabilize the situation, it intensified the collapse. Barthelot responded to uncertainty with force. Punishments became public and brutal. Whippings were carried out for minor infractions. Authority was enforced through fear rather than cohesion. As conditions worsened, the column began kidnapping local villagers and holding them hostage to extract food and supplies. This was no longer survival. It was coercion. Trust between the expedition and surrounding communities collapsed completely. Attacks became more frequent. Trade became impossible. The rear column existed in a state of constant threat, driven by hunger and paranoia, and Barthelot himself began to unravel. Witnesses later described erratic behavior, violent mood swings, obsessive suspicion, and an increasing fixation on asserting dominance. He openly questioned Stanley's intentions, suggesting that their leader had abandoned them deliberately. Whether Barthelot was losing his grip on reality or simply revealing what had always been there is difficult to say. What is clear is that the rear column had crossed a threshold. It was isolated, it was starving, and it was operating without oversight, accountability, or restraint. In that environment, moral limits did not disappear all at once. They eroded, and as they did, acts that would have been unthinkable elsewhere began to feel possible. The rear column was no longer waiting for rescue. It was waiting to collapse. By the time the rear column reached its breaking point, Edmund Barthelot was no longer simply a strict officer. He was unstable. Witness accounts describe a man whose authority had turned inward, obsessive, violent, and increasingly detached from the reality around him. Hunger and isolation did not soften him. They amplified what was already there. Barthelot ruled through humiliation. He enforced discipline through public beatings. He punished minor disobedience with extreme force. He treated both African laborers and his own men as expendable. Survivors later described him pacing through camp with a steel-pointed staff, prodding people as they passed, striking without warning. His presence alone became a source of fear. This was not leadership, it was domination. As conditions worsened, Barthelot's paranoia deepened. He openly suggested that Stanley had abandoned them deliberately, that the expedition's leader routinely returned from Africa while the men under him disappeared. At one point, Barthelot reportedly said that if Stanley were dead, it would be a blessing. That statement alone tells you how far the chain of command had deteriorated. His behavior grew more erratic. He accused his officers of plotting against him. He demanded constant displays of obedience. He oscillated between violent outbursts and moments of anxious self-awareness, at one point asking another officer whether he was sick enough to go home. But there was no going home. The rear column existed in a pressure chamber of fear, hunger, and unchecked authority. Barthelot was not restrained by law, oversight, or consequence. There was no higher power to appeal to, no court, no command structure that could intervene. And in that vacuum, cruelty became routine. The final incident was inevitable. Early one morning, Barthelot was disturbed by singing and drumming outside his quarters, a common cultural practice among local communities at dawn. He ordered it to stop. When it didn't, he escalated. Armed with a revolver and his steel-pointed staff, Barthelot confronted a woman beating a drum. He struck her. He kicked her. He continued despite her screams. Her husband, watching from nearby, saw a man armed and beating his wife without restraint. He fired. Barthelot was killed instantly. The officer, who had ruled through violence, died by it. And within days, the husband who shot him was executed. No justice was restored. No balance returned. Barthelot's death did not end the rear column's collapse. It merely removed one source of terror from a system already beyond recovery. What remained was a shattered group of men, stripped of leadership, morality, and direction. And among them was James Jameson, alive, observing, and about to be connected to the most disturbing allegation of the entire expedition. The most disturbing chapter of this expedition did not surface immediately. For years, it existed only as rumor, something whispered among survivors, deliberately omitted from official accounts, and quietly ignored while the expedition's leaders were celebrated as heroes. That changed in 1890. When Henry Morton Stanley returned to Europe, he published In Darkest Africa, a detailed account of the expedition. The book was a commercial success. Stanley was praised. The mission, despite its failures, was framed as a brutal but necessary undertaking. But people noticed what was missing. Stanley mentioned that Edmund Barthelot had been killed. He mentioned that James Jameson had died of illness. He did not explain how the rear column collapsed. And he did not explain what Jameson had allegedly done. When journalists pressed him, Stanley initially refused to elaborate, but eventually, under sustained scrutiny, he broke his silence. On the 8th of November, 1890, Stanley published a statement in the Times. In it, he acknowledged that the rear column had descended into chaos, and that he had deliberately censored its worst events in order to protect the reputations of the dead. Among those events was an allegation so severe that even Stanley hesitated to repeat it. James Jameson, he claimed, had paid to witness an act of cannibalism. Specifically, Stanley reported that Jameson had provided payment in cloth, which resulted in the killing of a young girl, so that he could observe and document the act. The reaction was immediate and incredulous. Jameson was not a nameless mercenary. He was not a disgraced officer. He was the grandson of one of the most respected businessmen in Ireland. The idea that such a man would not only witness, but enable something so horrific seemed impossible to many. Stanley himself admitted that the evidence was secondhand. Much of it came from survivors of the rear column men who had witnessed the collapse firsthand and had nothing to gain from inventing such a story. Most notably, the account originated from Jameson's interpreter, a man named Assad Farran. According to Farran, the event occurred while Jameson was attempting to re-establish contact with Tipu Tip and his trading networks. During a gathering with local leaders, Jameson expressed curiosity about cannibalism, a practice widely rumored in the region. What followed, according to Farran, was not misunderstanding. Jameson paid 6 handkerchiefs. A young girl was brought forward. She was killed, and Jameson observed the act as it unfolded. He later produced sketches depicting what he had seen. This was not a story about survival. It was not an act of desperation. It was an act driven by curiosity, by the belief that observation alone carried no moral responsibility. And once Stanley made the accusation public, the expedition was no longer remembered for its stated mission. It was remembered for this. The accusation did not land cleanly. Almost immediately, it fractured into argument, denial, and disbelief. Stanley himself acknowledged the weakness of the evidence. He was not claiming to have witnessed the act. He was repeating what others had told him, men who had survived the rear column and carried its secrets back to Europe. Critics seized on that point. They argued that Stanley was protecting his own reputation by shifting blame onto men who could no longer defend themselves. Barthelot was dead, Jameson was dead, convenient targets, Others suggested that Stanley had exaggerated the story to distract from the expedition's catastrophic failures. And then there was Asad Farhan. Farhan was Jameson's interpreter, the man closest to him during his interactions with local traders and chiefs. His account was detailed, specific, and deeply disturbing. According to Farhan, Jameson did not merely witness cannibalism. He paid for it. He followed the group. He sketched the process in stages. But Farhan was not an ideal witness. Years later, he would claim that he fabricated the story out of resentment that Jameson had mistreated him, dismissed him, or denied him payment. Jameson's widow seized on this reversal, publicly attacking Farhan's character and portraying him as a liar and a criminal. On its own, Farhan's testimony could be dismissed, but it was not alone. Another survivor of the rear column, William Bonney, corroborated key elements of the story. Bonney did not witness the killing itself, but he stated that Jameson personally showed him sketches depicting the event, multiple drawings showing the girl being killed, dismembered, and distributed. Bonney's description of the sketches aligned closely with Farhan's account, even if minor details differed. The number of sketches, the order of events, the final image. Those discrepancies mattered to skeptics. But they also raised a different question. If the story was fabricated, why did multiple witnesses describe the same visual evidence? The sketches themselves were never recovered. They do not exist today. But the fact that several men independently recalled seeing them made it increasingly difficult to dismiss the allegation as pure invention. Jameson's widow continued to fight publicly, releasing statements that framed her husband as a horrified observer, a man who never believed the act would actually take place and was trapped by events he could not control. That defense hinges on one assumption: that Jameson did not know what he was paying for. And that assumption would soon be tested against the one source no one could argue with: Jameson's own words. The debate could have continued indefinitely. Witness against witness, memory against motive. The living arguing over the actions of the dead. But there was one source that cut through nearly all of it: James Jameson's own diary. Jameson died in August of 1888, months before the expedition returned to Europe and years before the public controversy erupted. He did not write his account as a defense. He did not know his name would become associated with scandal. He was writing for himself. After his death, his journal was published under the title The Story of the Rear Column of the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition. Buried within it is an entry describing the very incident at the center of the accusation. Jameson recounts attending a gathering after a tribal dance. He describes being told casually that such events were often followed by the killing and consumption of people. He admits that he dismissed the claim as exaggerated folklore. Then comes the critical moment. An Arab present allegedly challenged him: "Give cloth and see." Jameson writes that he sent for 6 handkerchiefs, believing it to be a joke, a ruse to extract payment. He insists that he did not believe the act would actually occur. But according to his own words, a young girl was brought forward. She was killed in front of him. Her body was cut apart, and the men carried the pieces away to be washed and cooked. Jameson does not deny the payment. He does not deny his presence. He does not deny that the killing happened immediately after he provided the cloth. His defense is narrower. He claims disbelief. He writes that until the final moment, he could not bring himself to believe that the men were in earnest. He portrays himself as an observer, caught in a situation he did not expect to become real. But that explanation collapses under its own weight. Jameson had written elsewhere about cannibalism in the region. He had discussed it openly. He had heard repeated accounts of the practice. The idea that he genuinely believed payment would not result in violence strains credibility. Whether or not he intended the girl to die, his diary confirms the essential fact. He paid, she was killed. He watched. This was not hearsay. This was not accusation layered onto silence. It was admission. And once Jameson's own words are introduced, the question is no longer whether something happened. The question becomes whether ignorance absolves participation. At this point, the argument narrows. James Jameson did not deny the killing. He did not deny the payment. He did not deny that his action directly preceded the girl's death. His defense rests on a single claim. He did not believe it would really happen. That claim deserves scrutiny. Jameson was not naive. He was not unfamiliar with the region. He had written extensively about local customs, including cannibalism. He had heard repeated accounts describing exactly what he would later witness. More importantly, he was not coerced. No one forced him to offer payment. No one threatened him. No one demanded his participation. He acted out of curiosity. And curiosity, in this case, carried consequence. There is a temptation to frame Jameson as a passive observer, a man trapped in a moment he cannot stop, but his own account contradicts that framing. The sequence is clear: discussion, payment, killing. The act did not occur despite his involvement. It occurred because of it. This distinction matters. Jameson did not wield the knife, he did not issue the command, but he created the incentive. He transformed rumor into transaction. And once he did, the outcome was no longer hypothetical. This is where the moral collapse becomes impossible to ignore. In environments without law, responsibility does not disappear, it concentrates. The absence of restraint does not excuse action, it magnifies it. Barthelot abused authority openly and violently. His guilt was obvious, immediate, and physical. Jameson's role was quieter. He represented a different kind of danger, the belief that observation is neutral, that documentation is detached, that curiosity can exist without accountability. That belief is false. Curiosity without restraint is not passive, it is permissive. And in the rear column, where starvation, isolation, and power imbalance had already stripped away moral boundaries, that permission was enough. Jameson may not have intended a death, but intent is not the same as innocent. And when we strip away the language of disbelief and surprise, what remains is a simple chain of cause and effect. He paid, she died. He watched. It is impossible to hear this story without thinking of Heart of Darkness. Not because the novel explains it, but because it fails to exaggerate it. Joseph Conrad's Kurtz is often remembered as a symbol, a fictional extreme, a warning about what happens when civilization loses its grip and power, operates without consequence. But the men in this expedition did not need fiction to become unrecognizable. They lived it. Barthelot and Jameson represent two different paths to the same collapse. Barthelot embodied naked authority. He used violence to enforce order, and when that violence was no longer restrained by law or oversight, it turned inward and consumed him. His breakdown was loud, visible, and unmistakable. Jameson's collapse was quieter. He did not dominate others physically. He did not terrorize a camp. He did not rule through fear. He observed. And that is what makes his case more unsettling. Jameson entered the Congo with the mindset of a Victorian intellectual, that the world could be understood through careful study, that witnessing carried no inherent moral weight. He treated atrocity as data, suffering as spectacle. This is the psychology Conrad was circling. Not madness in the traditional sense, but moral detachment. When systems of restraint disappear, men do not always become monsters overnight. Some simply stop seeing limits. They begin to believe that because something can be observed, it may be observed. Because something exists, it may be documented. And once that line is crossed, the distinction between observer and participant collapses. Jameson did not go mad. He normalized the unthinkable. That normalization is what connects him to Kurtz, not excess, but justification. The belief that the environment excuses the act. That distance erases responsibility. The Congo did not corrupt these men by force. It revealed them, removed from consequence, surrounded by exploitation already in progress, and embedded within a system that treated human life as a resource. The expedition became a pressure test. Some failed through brutality, others failed through curiosity, and both failures led to the same result. When the expedition finally ended, the men who survived returned to Europe as celebrities. Henry Morton Stanley was praised. His book sold widely. The mission was remembered, if at all, as a brutal but necessary endeavor. The Congo moved on. Europe moved on. James Jameson did not live to see his name questioned. He died of fever in 1888, attempting to reach a telegraph station. According to one man who was with him at the end, Jameson's final words were frantic, speaking of figures approaching, of standing together against something unseen. Some took that as delirium. Others wondered if it was something else. His family fought to protect his reputation. Newspapers debated. Witnesses contradicted one another. Over time, the story softened at the edges. It became controversy rather than fact. Debate rather than reckoning. And at the center of all of it was someone history never bothered to name. A young girl, purchased for cloth, killed to satisfy curiosity, remembered only through testimony and denial. No monument was built for her. No record preserved her life. She exists in history only because men argued about what they did to her. That is often how the darkest chapters survive. Not as lessons, not as warnings, but as unresolved discomfort. The Jameson Cannibal Affair is not disturbing because it is unique. It is disturbing because it is ordinary within its context. It emerged naturally from a system that commodified land, labor, and life itself, and then gave educated, well-respected men the freedom to act without consequence. Barthelot collapsed through cruelty. Jameson collapsed through detachment. Different paths. Same result. When power operates without oversight, violence does not need to be ordered. It only needs to be permitted. And sometimes, all it takes is curiosity and the belief that watching is not the same as participating. That is the legacy of this expedition. Not discovery, not heroism, but a reminder that when accountability disappears, the distance between civilization and atrocity is far shorter than we like to believe. And that is mostly everything you need to know about the Jameson Cannibal Affair.